right now, without that leadership, our country is failing kids. And in the past 15 years of First Focus's work in policy and advocacy across a wider range of issues, what we've noticed is that children are consistently an afterthought in policy. They're a quarter of our population, but their needs, their interests, their views are not prioritized. And what that means is our policies don't aim to ensure that children grow up healthy, grow up safe, grow up in thriving families. Every government issue impacts kids, from housing to taxes to the environment, but there's currently no position that takes a comprehensive look across all these government agencies and facilitates coordination to make sure the holistic needs of children are met. So a high-level position, whether that be independent or within the executive branch, would help children be visible and central in policy making. It would help, it could be that position that is in charge of having the insight into the big picture of what kids need and coordinating across government. It could be an authoritative voice on children's interests and be a bridge between children themselves and policymakers. And so that would increase the likelihood that each policy, whether by the administration or Congress, not only decreases harm to kids, but advances things that are good for kids: safety, healthy development, thriving family life. That's what a high-level leadership position for kids would mean. Lack of leadership means that there isn't someone in the room whose sole goal and purpose is to raise the alarm for policies that would impact children, especially when children from marginalized communities would be harmed the most. So regarding family separation, there was a really incredible investigative article recently in The Atlantic by Caitlin Dickerson about both the cruelty and the bad governance that led to the family separation policy, such that hundreds of children remain separated now 4 years later. And I think there are two things in the way that family separation came to be that highlights the failure of leadership for kids. The first thing is that while cruelty to children was the point of this policy, there are also so many ways that the impact on children wasn't even considered. So the Department of Health and Human Services, which has custody of children who are separated from parents, was not meaningfully included in discussions about this policy. It was seen as an immigration issue. So the non-immigration agencies, the child-focused agencies like HHS, weren't at the table and couldn't raise concerns about the social and emotional impact of this policy, the logistical nightmare of tracking family relationships and placing kids. So that's the first thing, is the ways kids were not considered. For those who were in government, who cared about kids and wanted to prevent harm, those people weren't in leadership. There were career government staff who did their best to track families, who raised the harms of this policy to leadership multiple times, but their emails and their memos were ignored. These people didn't have a child-focused leader to go to with their concerns. They didn't have an authority who could back them up about the harms that were being perpetrated. I can't say for sure what would have been different if there had been high-level leadership for kids during this policy, but a well-structured, well-resourced leadership position for children, especially a position like an independent commissioner, would have had insight and authority to speak to the issues that were factors in the creation of a policy like family separation. Kids are a quarter of the population of the United States. Kids are the most diverse generation in the United States, and they are the entirety of our nation's future. So if our government is serious about equity, if it's serious about the prosperity of our nation going forward, it has to adopt a comprehensive children's agenda that makes children's best interests central in policymaking. So that means high-level leadership, but it also means having a clear standards of what our policies are aiming for when it comes to good outcomes for kids, and structural mechanisms to evaluate whether our policies are achieving those outcomes. So the best interest of a child standard is exactly that. It's a set of factors. It is that standard by which we can say, are we doing what's good for kids? And a standard like this would force government officials to face the reality that a policy like family separation would negatively impact every aspect of a child's life, not just their family integrity, but also the risk of a child being exposed to someone who could exploit them, or the impact of the trauma on a child's physical and mental health. And then the question becomes, how do we know that the government is evaluating policies based on these factors, and how do we hold them accountable? And that's what child impact statements are about. They're a systematic tool to make the government publicly put pen to paper about how a policy would impact children and make the government justify how it could possibly move forward with a policy that hurts kids. So an agenda that makes the government work for kids and that prioritizes their well-being has to be comprehensive, with both the tools to focus on policy on children and the leadership in place to use those tools and ensure that children are both figuratively and literally at the decision-making table. So one version is having someone within the federal government. So that could be either at the, someone like at the White House level who focuses on kids, or having a separate government agency that focuses on kids and deals with all issues that impact kids. And then there's also the option of someone who's kind of independent of the government, someone who is outside of the executive or legislative branch, has a modicum of independence, but has resources to do research, to give policy recommendations, to consult directly with children, and can give recommendations both to the executive branch and to the legislative branch. And best practices dictate having both of those at the same time, because on the one hand, you need the coordination from within the government, but you also need that person who is outside the government who can be seen as an authority and seen as the expert on what is good for kids.